South Carolina DHEC officials have given the WestEdge Foundation the green light to cap the historic Gadsden Creek to begin further development. Today, I talk one-on-one with Michael Maher of the WestEdge Foundation for this edition of Quintin's Close-Ups. And if you haven't already, subscribe to my YouTube channel and like Quintin's Close-Ups on Facebook. Michael Maher, welcome back to Quintin's Close-Ups.
Good to be here.
Yes, sir. Oh, always. And I know that obviously you're the CEO of the WestEdge Foundation. And I know that recently there's a headline on Channel 2's website that reads this: DHEC gives green light for WestEdge Foundation to cap the Gadsden Creek. And obviously, as I mentioned in the headline from Channel 2, state health officials have approved plans to begin infilling a historic downtown Charleston Creek to make room for further development. Let me ask you this. When did you all submit your plans?
Well, we began this process in 2013, a meeting both with the Army Corps of Engineers and then with South Carolina DHEC and OCRM. We've been working with them as well as other stakeholders, environmental advocates, people from the community, neighborhood groups, since 2013. We have, through that process, had submitted probably 3 different rounds of permit information, some of it which, as we worked on the project, as we worked with stakeholders, modified the plans, adapted the plans, so forth. I think all of it has improved it. And then ultimately, the final submission, I believe, was in 2018, 2019. There were a couple of public hearings. And then since then, we've been responding to any of those questions. And DHEC has been considering all of the data, all of the information. We're pleased that South Carolina DHEC really did work hard at weighing all the viewpoints on this challenging situation, and they've clearly recognized that taking significant action to improve the situation is the right thing to do. So we're pleased to be able to do exactly that, and that's what we intend to do when we get through the final steps of this permit process. And what are the final steps right now, Michael? Well, the DHEC process does have an opportunity for people to request a board review of the permit determination by the South Carolina DHEC staff. That occurs over the next 15 days, I guess. And then following that, if there is a board review, the board review would occur. But really, ultimately, the important thing is for the DHEC permit to be conveyed to the Army Corps of Engineers, who ultimately would provide the permit that we would need to be able to do the actual work that we're proposing to improve the drainage, to add new outfalls, new connections of outfalls, new connections to the deep tunnel system, and then ultimately cap the rest of the site after all of those connections have been made. And from 2013 to right now in 2021, Michael, how did you all modify and actually adapt to those plans? Well, a number of things that were done. In many respects, the initial proposal to where we are today is completely different. But ultimately, where we came to was a strategy that takes the stormwater that's flowing into this area, and right now it has really one way to get out to the Ashley River, and that's through the current water course that runs through WestEdge. What we're proposing, or what's proposed in our permit and what has been endorsed through that permit by the DHEC's findings, is to divert that that stormwater, in 3 ways. One, to connect those areas that are able to be connected to the city's deep tunnel system, to be able to do that. Now, that can only occur after we have stopped the tidal inflow that's occurring, flooding Haygood Street, because some of those areas that are not currently connected to the deep tunnel system can't be connected because they are tidally influenced. The areas of Gadsden Green, Ashton, and Allway Street have the risk of high tides, and those high tides would then, if they were connected to the deep tunnel, would be flooding the deep tunnel. So once we're able to, through the permit, prevent the tide from flowing in, we can make connections for that stormwater for Gadsden Green, Ashton, Allway areas, and Harborview area to then go into the deep tunnel system. So that's one area that we would divert flow of water, stormwater to. The second within the permit is to create a new connection along Fishburne Street from the lowest area of the site, which is the intersection of Fishburne and Haygood. And that connection would go underneath Fishburne to an outfall that exists right now behind or between Stony Field and the National Guard Armory, north of Fishburne. We would be cleaning out and opening up that outfall and then installing tide gates at the area where it goes underneath Fishburne, so that that connection would not be providing an opportunity for the tides to flow back into the area of Fishburne and Haygood. So we prevent that tidal flooding in that area. And then the third piece is to take the water, the stormwater that falls within the West Edge area, and to collect that into a completely new system, part of which we've put in place under the currently constructed West Edge Street that runs in front of the Publix, that we'd be connecting to that system, and that would be flowing out underneath Lockwood as it does today. But that would be a system that would be under the surface rather than on the surface, so that it would be completely separated from the landfill contamination that is within the landfill area all around West Edge.
With that new system, how much would that cost you all?
The total cost of the estimated cost of all of those steps, as well as the mitigation project, which is required to mitigate for the replacement or to create a replacement for the wetland areas that are currently there, all of that work combined is about $15 million. So it's a significant investment. It's a significant project. It'll take a bit of time to actually put in place once we get the permit. But we are, as I mentioned, as soon as we have the permit in hand, we're prepared to go ahead and begin the work. That mitigation project, which is a fourth piece, if you will, of the permit, is in order to mitigate for the 3.8 acres of wetland area that will be impacting. We have proposed to do a what's called a permittee responsible mitigation project, a PRM, by recapturing about a little over 17 acres of former wetland that had been made into a golf course further up river on the Ashley River, and converting that back into wetland area. So we'd be creating 17 acres of essentially new, or recreating 17 acres of new wetland area in compensation, if you will, for the 3.8 acres that would be lost on the West Edge site.
Now, those tidal floodgates, how many of those do you want?
Well, we have already installed one tide gate. When we started doing construction work on Lockwood, we recognized, unfortunately too late, that there was no stormwater drainage underneath Lockwood. And so during our construction process, there started to be more flooding on Lockwood, especially between what is now West Edge Street and Spring Street. There's kind of a low-lying area there. And so we doubled back, worked with the city, got a permit to put in new stormwater from Spring Street to West Edge and connecting to the outfall underneath Lockwood. And that connection has a tide gate installed in it, so that the water is not flowing back up from the tides and flooding Lockwood. So that's one that's already in place. We would be putting, I think it actually ends up being 2 tide gates that would go in at the location of the Fishburne outfall. But those would be the extent of the tide gates.
Now, what is the current tidal, inflow?
Well, on a unfortunately far too regular basis, when we get high tides, in fact, last night, the night before last, and I wasn't there last night, I was there the night before last, and all of Haygood and Fishburne were underwater from high tide. Over 150 instances of high tide last year. Our engineering teams have documented over 150 instances of tidal flooding along Haygood and Fishburne. It's gotten so bad and so regular, you may have noticed that the city has actually put in a warning system at the intersections of Fishburne and Haygood with flashing lights to say, when there's high water, don't drive through this, because it gets deep enough that it impacts automobiles, and obviously you don't want people walking through it either.
Yes, sir. And you talked earlier about the data that obviously DHEC has. What type of data are they looking at right now?
Well, they've looked at all of the data prior to making their permit decision. So I don't think they're looking at anything more right now, but they've looked at all of the tide data that I just mentioned, the number of times, the increase, the depth of the water, the topographic areas, how the tide areas relate to the topography of the site area and how low it is and how the high tides impact particularly the lower parts of Gadsden Green and some of the houses, the homes that are along there. They also were considering the data that we collected on the contamination that is both in soils and in water that exists there because of the history of the site as a landfill. And so all of those high tides and whenever there's a heavy rain, the stormwater, not only are they a nuisance for people trying to get someplace, they also are conveying contamination. And we found some really startling numbers of concentrations of contaminants such as lead and arsenic, PCBs. There was some independent testing that was done that also identified DDT, which is a pesticide that was outlawed in the 1970s, the early 1970s, and many other types of heavy metal type contaminations, as well as high levels of bacteria, fecal coliform and E. coli types of bacteria that particularly when there are heavy influxes of water, both tidal and stormwater, those numbers are really, really quite high. And they're high enough that if it were a swimming hole, if it was a beach, for example, it would have to be shut down. And the idea that we have students who are trying to get to the Charleston Development Academy and they're having to walk through that, or students who are trying to go to Burke, or people who are just simply trying to get to their homes, having to walk through water like that. And then all of that water backs up as far as really into Harmon Field.
Right.
And again, we got play fields where children are playing, where it might be a day or two earlier, there was water covering it, and that water may have had contamination in it and deposited some of that onto the field. So all of that we think is really an untenable situation, and that's why we feel very strongly that much more significant and serious action needs to be taken to address that. And stopping the tidal inflow is a really big part of that.
And how long has this, lead and all these other discoveries have been back there in your mind?
Well, the history of the site as a landfill
Right.
has been known. Over time, because of the settlement of the land and because of the increase of high tides, the interface of water and those contaminants that are underneath has become more and more pronounced as the cap that's over the landfill starts to erode. But even the fact that it's settled to such an extent that puts it underneath even medium tide levels means that those areas more and more have water intrusion, and then that water, like I say, is a conveyance or a vector for those contaminants. We hadn't done the specific testing that we've submitted to DHEC when we first began in 2013, but there was a history of other sites that had and other investigations that we knew had identified some levels of contamination. It was only this past year and a half that we did another round of testing, as well as soil tests and water tests. And in fact, you might even remember I guess it was about 3 years ago, the Post and Courier had done a series on the contamination of floodwaters in Charleston, and the Haygood and Line area was one area that they tested and found very high levels of bacteria there. So, the testing and the acknowledgement of this kind of contamination has been around for a little while. We just think it's time to really do something about it and stop talking about it, and that's why we're proposing to do what we're doing.
Now, with that cap eroding, how long has it been eroding?
Well, I mean, the cap was put in place in 1973. It's been maintained over time.
Okay.
More material has been added to it and so forth. But as you can imagine, there's probably like two things you can't fight. You can't fight tides and you can't fight gravity. And so the tides coming in, they come in every day twice.
Right.
And it's a lot of water that's flowing through there. And that water is going to pick up every day a little bit of sediment. It's going to move the sediments around. So that kind of scouring that happens, and then the heavy rain might create some of that. So it's an ongoing challenge to maintain a cap when you have water running through it. And so that's really the core of what we're trying to do, is to stop the water from running through the landfill by capping it entirely. And then any water that we do have running through is connected to the Ashley River through conveyances that are no longer susceptible to being eroded. The connections we'll make will be reinforced to the point where there's not going to be an issue where soil eroding away exposes contamination. We'll have liners, we'll have culverts, as was the case in the 54-inch culvert that we put under WestEdge Street, concrete culverts, so that that kind of intrusion and that kind of ongoing erosion ceases to exist. So this is where we believe this kind of action, this kind of significant action, although expensive, is the closest we can have to a permanent solution to the problem.
As a matter of fact, the move, according to Channel 2, has some activists upset, as you know, but I know that you also told Channel 2 that it's a necessary price for expansion. What will be the price of this expansion?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the price of
the expansion when you think of the homes and shops that you want to put, in that area.
Mm-hmm. Well, the price of being able to continue the development in those directions would be the replacement of all of this infrastructure we're talking about. So the $15 million
Right.
Of investment, that's in many ways the price of it. But if you will, all of the work that we've done to date to try to understand the situation, to try to understand the engineering challenges, that's also the price of it. To try to determine a solution and then to try to work with the community and try to work with various stakeholders to come up with a solution that works for everybody. And that includes changes to the plans that quite frankly were ideas of the stakeholders, environmental advocates in the community, and not necessarily ones that our engineers recommended. So as an example, you may recall right now along Haygood between Line Street and Fishburne, there's some wetland area there across from Harmon Field. In fact, it's spreading to Harmon Field. If you go along Haygood on the other side, on the east side of the street, there's areas that are already starting to get like a wetland, if you will, and have wetland characteristics. So what we are doing as a part of our plan is to create a new basin, or recreate, if you will, a new basin along Haygood in that location, but one which is controlled, one which has a liner underneath it that prevents the intermingling of water and the landfill. And it'll be fresh water. It won't be salt water. It won't be tidally influenced. That's where the tide gates on Fishburne come in, is to prevent the tide coming back into there. But the other opportunity with that basin is to create an amenity for the community, an expansion, if you will, of Harmon Field as green space. So the design of that currently is really conceptual in nature. We have to know, we have already had to establish the capacity of the basin, but all of the edges around the basin, whether it's a walking trail, whether they're seating areas, whether there are areas, one idea that's been talked about is, could we provide an area that recognizes the history of baptisms that occurred in the area in the history. Certainly, nobody would want anybody to be out in the creek bed right now doing any kind of baptisms or anything like that because of the contamination. But if we can create a clean place, and that's something, at the very least, to recognize that history. It doesn't necessarily mean that people are currently using it that way, but it's part of the history. And so that's one of the things that people have raised is, can we include some of that in this basin area that will be a new piece of public green space and a new amenity. So I think that's an improvement ultimately that really came out of all of the interactions that we've had since 2013.
Now, who are the stakeholders that you want to bring to the table right now?
Well, we continue to work with really, we all say all of stakeholders. When we're talking about stakeholders, besides WestEdge as an entity, we're obviously talking about the city and the city's stormwater department, and making sure that what we're doing is in alignment with the city's long-term stormwater goals, as well as the city's resilience office, to make sure that we're not doing anything that doesn't circumvent long-term investments the city wants, and hopefully actually improves the situation as to the city's resilience to climate change, sea level rise, and so forth. But other stakeholders include the Westside Neighborhood Association, the Charleston Waterkeeper, South Carolina Coastal Conservation League, the people of Gadsden Green, the people who live along Ashton and Allway Street, and even now the people who now live in WestEdge. These are all people who are invested in the neighborhood and invested in the community. we've also had a lot of outreach with Burke High School. I sit on the Burke High School School Improvement Council. We've talked about ways in which WestEdge and the activities of WestEdge can help improve the opportunities for area youth. So that's not about infrastructure and pipes and drainage. That's about intellectual infrastructure that helps support the growth and prosperity of those who live in the community. So all of them are part of our stakeholders. Obviously, the Friends of Gadsden Creek have very strong and very loud voices. We've met with them on a number of occasions. In fact, the first time I met with the leader of the Friends was probably in 2014, Cyrus Botham, and we walked the site and so forth. So we have made a lot of outreach there. Regrettably, although we've had great interactions and collaboration with most of the stakeholders, the Friends of Gadsden Creek have not really been collaborators. Even though we have met with them on a number of occasions, their positions are always ones that we just simply can't accommodate and solve the problems that are there.
As a matter of fact, let me go to their side of the story because a member of the Friends of Gadsden Creek told News 2, quote, all it is land seizure. All it is taking up property, taking of natural resources from a community just to build another either condo or parking garage. It's not going to do anything that would serve the community that is directly situated next to the creek. How then will WestEdge serve the community surrounding community?
Well, first of all, just to address some of those accusations, there is no land seizure that's occurring. There is no seizure of anything that belongs to the community, and in fact, the entirety of WestEdge is occurring without any displacement of any individuals. And so the concerns that the WestEdge project is this kind of nefarious beast that's trying to chew up the community, I think is just simply overblown and unfortunate. In fact, as I mentioned, all of the things that we were just talking about in terms of $15 million of infrastructure investment, that's on top of $20 million of infrastructure investment that we've already done within WestEdge, some of which is addressing traffic situations, some of which is addressing flooding situations. All of these are improvements that will help the community. Right now, the community is dealing with flooding on a daily basis. They're dealing with tidal flooding, they're dealing with stormwater problems, they're dealing with contamination. The benefits to the community start with removing the impacts of all of that flooding. The risk to people's homes and livelihoods, the risk that people can't actually get services from emergency responders because they can't get to their home because of a flood. Those are all great community benefits. In WestEdge to date, in the first phase, we've already created over 1,000 new jobs that are within the community, and these are jobs that are accessible for people who live within the West Side, who can now have the opportunity to walk or bike to an employment center, and that's just going to grow. The addition of the Publix, a full-service grocery with a pharmacy, is also a dramatic improvement for the community. They now have easy access to healthy food, affordable food. The west side of the community, the west side of Charleston Peninsula, believe it or not, was a food desert before the Publix came along. And the addition of the pharmacy also provides a resource for the community to get the healthcare needs that they have, and to get it within their own neighborhood. So these are all great benefits. The additional activities that we're talking about in terms of building more affordable housing, helping the city build more affordable housing, these are all additional benefits. So to suggest that what we're doing is just about quote unquote seizing resources from the community is absolutely untrue.
WestEdge, obviously you all say its purpose is to build shops, homes, and restaurants, that is, to support the Medical University of South Carolina and create economic development on the west side of the Charleston Peninsula. How many of those minority-owned shops and restaurants does WestEdge intend to bring in?
I'm sorry, how many of the
minority-owned shops and businesses and restaurants do you intend to bring in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, we've already, right now, there are, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but there are a number of new businesses that have been created. About half of those businesses are women-owned businesses. In terms of minority ownership, we don't have any businesses right now that are minority ownership. I'm sorry, we do have one that's minority Asian American ownership, but we obviously are interested in creating more and more opportunity for that kind of activity to occur, and for people from the community to be able to establish businesses within WestEdge. There will be additional opportunities with new developments within WestEdge, as well as the shop spaces that are already there. There is also within WestEdge 2 incubator activity zones, one for technology incubation of startup companies that provide below market rate space for startup companies, as well as one that we're working on right now for life science companies.
Now, let me reread it from Channel 2. It says this: WestEdge says its purpose is to build shops, homes, and restaurants to support the Medical University of South Carolina. How do you hope to support Gaston Creek instead over the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, there are 2 parts to WestEdge's mission, and that's Channel 2's quote. Let me tell you my explanation of our mission. WestEdge's purpose is twofold. One is to promote not the medical university, but to promote the research and clinical functions that occur within the medical university and the medical district. That's by providing opportunities for new companies that might grow out of the research, and for the development of new technologies that will help to advance healthcare and healthcare activity within Charleston into the future. But our second purpose is to create economic development and improve the quality of life on the West Side. And what we've been talking about is part of improving the quality of life on the West Side. Removing the impact of flooding, removing the impacts of contamination, removing the inability for people to get to their jobs because they can't get out of their home, or they can't get across from one side of the neighborhood to the other side of the neighborhood. These are all improvements that improve the quality of life. The investments that we're making within WestEdge and our connections with the community will also continue to improve the possibilities and opportunity for people on the West Side. The work that we're doing with Burke High School to create new internships in time within WestEdge, so that students who are in the upper levels at Burke High School have an opportunity for being ported directly into jobs that are within their community, that are accessible to them, and then give them the opportunity for great careers. These are all investments that will help the quality of life on the West Side, including Gadsden Green, including the West Side neighborhood, and including the West Side of the peninsula.
And you told Channel 2 that WestEdge is not displacing anyone in the community in regards to the comments from the Friends of Gaston Creek, but is that displacing their quality of life?
I don't believe anything that we're doing displaces their quality of life. Being able to get to healthy food is an improvement in quality of life. Being able to be at your home and not worry about flooding on a regular basis improves your quality of life. Creating opportunities so that the youth of the West Side of Gadsden Green have an opportunity for careers, whether it be in health sciences, whether it be in life sciences, or whether it be in the retail sector, whether it's in getting a career going within Publix or with some of the other retailers. These are all improvements to people's quality of life. This does not take away from people, it adds to people.
And obviously, you talked to me about the new drainage infrastructure that will be able to divert stormwater while keeping some greenery and adding an area to showcase the historical aspects of the creek. Has the community been able to look at these new drainage infrastructure plans?
Of course. They're on our website. They've been presented all the way through the process that we've gone through. As I mentioned, we've had 3 different public hearings. All of the permitting information is also accessible through South Carolina DHEC. It's all public record. There are all of the plans, all of the drainage plans, all of the infrastructure, including the green space improvement that we're talking about, the basin along Haygood. Those are all part of the permit application. So they're conditions of the permit. So it's not like we can get the permit and decide to do something else. We get the permit. The permit is for us to do exactly what we say we're going to do. And that's what we will do.
And I know the Coastal Conservation League says they have been advocating to bring the creek under the protections of the Clean Water Act and working with WestEdge to add more wetlands to help with the flood control. What protections of the Clean Water Act were you working with the Coastal Conservation League on, that is?
I'm not familiar with that. That was a statement that Channel 2 put out, but I'm not familiar with the Coastal Conservation League working to put this under a Clean Water Act.
Okay.
I do know that the Coastal Conservation League, as well as Charleston Waterkeeper, wants to make sure that the waters, especially the Ashley River, can be maintained in a clean fashion. And they both recognize that what's happening today at Gadsden Creek is actually taking contaminants out of the landfill and conveying them out to the Ashley River and polluting the Ashley River. And so that's one of the reasons they are supporting what we're doing. I think that the expansion that is being described is the work that we've been doing with them and with others for the mitigation project, having identified the Kings Grant Golf Course as a location for mitigation. And what's important about that is that the mitigation process for saltwater wetlands is not an easy process because there are not many places where you can actually do mitigation that is applicable to mitigation for saltwater wetland areas. And when we began this process, the only opportunity for mitigation was actually a mitigation bank that's down in Jasper County, close to Savannah, much closer to Savannah than it is to Charleston. It through our work with the Open Space Institute, SCCL, and the Charleston Waterkeeper, that the Kings Grant Golf Course had been identified as a possible location for a mitigation that came available over the last really 5 years. And so we worked with OSI to try to lock that in so that it could be used for mitigation and not developed with new homes. And so that process gave us the ability to continue on our permitting process and to continue with a mitigation proposal, which wouldn't put the mitigation in Jasper County, but would put it in Charleston County on the Ashley River. And we think that's really important.
Yes. Yes, indeed. Michael Maher, thank you so much for your time. And again, welcome back to Quintin's Close-Ups.
Thank you, Quintin.
Likewise.